So within nutraceuticals, we have some macro trends, and more consumers are looking for evidence-based products. And this really builds back to trust, which Nard mentioned earlier on. So people are looking for products which are based on good science, more and more. And there's also a trend for plant-based, and we've seen already, I think all three startups that we've heard from this morning are plant-based, and this is definitely a trend which doesn't look to be going anywhere, which is quite interesting also. We also see a trend for sustainability where consumers are looking more and more for products which are sustainable, both in how they're sourced, but also how they're packaged, and finally how they're distributed. And all of this really builds into transparency, which again, Nard mentioned earlier on. So this is some macro trends within the general nutraceuticals and functional food space. So again, I'm not going to dwell on those too long. But if we look at the immune segment specifically, there are only 10 micronutrients with approved health claims from the European Food Safety Authority. So you'll see 4 trace elements and 6 vitamins. We tend to hear a lot about vitamin C and D, but maybe not so much about the rest. And similarly, we tend to hear a lot about selenium and zinc, maybe not so much about copper and iron, which again is quite interesting. But really, this is kind of the old school approach, whereas the new school kind of looks at a more modern approach. So consumers view immunity as a long-term state, which perhaps is an opportunity and perhaps a barrier, depending on how you look at it. Not necessarily consumers are in for a quick fix. And this is achievable through strategies that are preventative and also proactive. So in other words, consumers are well aware that, you know, to prevent a cold or a flu next month, they may need to start doing something healthier today. And similarly, if they are struck down with a flu, that, you know, popping some nutraceutical is unlikely to have a very acute effect as such. Also, we see consumers involved in thinking of bodies compassionately, but also holistically. And I've just expanded on that on the next slide, where we've top conditions to be managed currently. And again, this is currently, which is heavily tied to, I suppose, the global pandemic we're in. We have stress, anxiety, sleep, and disrupted sleep, the gastrointestinal tract, and inflammation. And consumers more and more realize that all of these are related to immunity. So somebody may, in fact, you know, seek out a product for stress levels to actually help their immunity, as opposed to just going straight for a product generally for immunity. This becomes interesting because a lot of these areas don't necessarily have health claims approved by European Food Safety Authority. So there's definitely barriers, but definitely opportunity here as well. If we look at some trending immune supporting nutrients, we have vitamin C, which has really always been around for the immune system. It's always been an ingredient of interest, but more and more we see consumers looking at food sources as well. So obviously citrus, but also things like acerola cherry and rosehip. So I know a couple of manufacturers have told me that their sales of vitamin C hasn't really changed and maybe has actually decreased. Whereas their sales of food sourced vitamin C, perhaps fortified with rosehip or acerola, has actually increased markedly, again, just within 2020. We also see elderberry, which I'll talk a little bit about again later on. Vitamin D, which is quite interesting, and I have time, I might show some vitamin D data on COVID. Mushrooms, specifically medicinal mushrooms. Green tea, again, especially of interest at the moment. Selenium and zinc, again, we know there's European Food Safety Authority health claims for both of these, but absolutely of interest to consumers. And garlic, again, is one of those ingredients which has been around for quite a long time and known to be important for immune health and inflammation. And then we see turmeric, which seems to be absolutely everywhere. I suppose the market is nearly saturated, but still very much of interest as well. And in tandem with that, ginger and turmeric actually come from the same family of plant. But we also see antioxidants. Antioxidants being very much of interest, as well as fibers, again going back to general immune function, but also gut health. and then adaptogens like rhodiola and so on. I just got a message on the screen. Can everybody still hear me?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes,
perfect, perfect. So this graph just shows, now I've taken this from the Nutrition Business Journal, and just shows the general food supplement market by segment. So 31% is by far the biggest segment, and that's for sports and energy. And this was expected sales in 2020. And we can see that's followed by general health, and then cold and flu or general immunity was about 10%. But you can also see things like gastrointestinal health, which ties back to immunity, is another 6%. And then if we look at inflammation as well, that's another 4%. So we can very quickly see how we can add up different segments to look at immunity. But then, of course, COVID hit. So I couldn't talk about immunity in 2020 without mentioning COVID. So the Innova consumer survey just released has shown that 60% of global consumers are increasingly looking for food and beverage products that support their immune system. And this isn't just supplements, this is food and beverage products. So from drinks to powdered ingredients to capsules, right through. And also 1 in 3, so 33% say their concerns about immune health have increased in 2020 compared to 2019. And again, perhaps not surprising, but still quite interesting. As COVID remains a top concern really globally, demand for immune support supplements continues to increase. And the category is projected to grow at a CAGR of almost 6% over the forecast period of 2020 to 2027, and to hit $22.5 billion globally. And again, that's just for the immune segment. And that's not for nutraceuticals in general, it's just for the immune segment. So massive growth, which again, you can see on this slide, an estimated growth of over 50% in 2020 alone, which is absolutely unprecedented. And again, you can see it on the graph. This is the growth, and the bars actually represent the sales. So you can see it is increasing steadily until 2020, and it's expected to increase by 50% this year alone. And then you can see that demand is expected to be maintained. So although COVID, we don't really know what's going to happen in terms of a vaccine or anything else, but you can see that immunity now is in the hearts and minds of consumers. If I show you the graph on the right, this pie chart, you can see that vitamin C, even though it's been around for a long time, is still the biggest individual segment for immune health, bigger than multivitamins. And you can see things like probiotics is a smaller segment, but absolutely growing, and similarly for elderberry, which I think I mentioned again on the next slide. So again, similar graph here on the right, but if I bring your attention to the left, you can actually see that vitamin C is still growing, probiotics is growing, multivitamins, even though it's the biggest segment, is still growing for immunity. But look at elderberry increasing by 200%. So demand for elderberry is absolutely skyrocketing. I don't have time to go into some of the science, but there is some evidence behind, scientific evidence behind elderberry for general immune health. Nothing specific to COVID, at least not yet. But any of the research on elderberry may not in fact be specific to elderberry. It's just that other research on other berries hasn't been done to the same extent. So I think it's worthwhile keeping an eye out on different berries in the future, looking at the specific properties of berries like anthocyanins and so on, in blackcurrants, blackberries, raspberries, etc. So I just want to talk about vitamin D for a minute. Traditionally, vitamin D was known for bone health only and not really to be of importance elsewhere. But science has demonstrated that there's vitamin D receptors systemically all over the body, from the prostate to the brain to the breast to the colon and everywhere else, on almost every single type of cell in the human body. When observational research demonstrates vitamin D, is associated with, I haven't completed this sentence, because vitamin D is associated with pretty much every disease under the planet. However, that becomes very important to differentiate between an association and a cause, because vitamin D is unique in that it's the only vitamin that we derive from the sun, from sunlight exposure, and actually diet is quite a minor source to compare to sunlight. So if you imagine I've got Caucasian skin, if I stand out in the sun in summer and get 20 minutes of sun, I will make about 20,000 units of vitamin D. And compare that to a large piece of salmon, which might have about 800 units. So 20,000 for 20 minutes of sun versus 800 for a large piece of fish. And you can see very quickly that vitamin D is really from the sun. And why that becomes important is who doesn't get sun? Well, people who maybe are bedbound. And then we do all these studies showing that people who are bedbound have low vitamin D. And we think if we give people vitamin D, it's going to make them get out of bed. It doesn't quite work like that, unfortunately. But nevertheless, in sake of time, I'm going to keep going. Vitamin D is a small segment of the immunity market. So this is immune health. This is not the nutraceuticals market in general or the bone health market. This is just looking at immunity. You see, vitamin D is quite a small player. It wasn't even on the graphs I showed you earlier on. However, it's projected to grow massively, almost 10% this year alone. For growth, for total growth in vitamin D, and also specific to immunity. So there's massive opportunities in vitamin D. And you can see again sales of vitamin D, even though plain vitamin D is quite cheap, it's still a massive market, worth I think about 200 million, sorry, in the US alone. So a big market and growing. But if we come back to COVID, so there's little intervention research to support any specific nutritional approach. However, as I told you earlier on, consumers are proactive and they're looking for preventative strategies which are going to support their general immune health, and also things like their gut, their sleep, their stress, and so on. So interestingly, economic consequences may lead to increased demand for healthy, health-supporting food and beverages. And this will certainly be different in different global jurisdictions, depending on things like healthcare availability and insurance models and so on. But consumers are looking for nutrient-dense products with functional benefits and proactive wellness. So I wanted to just finish off with a case study, and this is my own startup company, Phytofix, again, phyte meaning plant. So this was founded at the very start of 2019. And 2019 was spent navigating the complex regulatory and ethical pathways for two products which were designed based on my own research and expertise. So one for blood pressure and one for blood sugar. So you can see these are some awards that I won for this research, and this was quite exciting. And progress was constant until March 2020, when we were about to launch our clinical trials of our blood pressure and blood sugar products, until COVID came to Ireland, which is where we're based. This completely cancelled our plans for clinical research. And of course, like a lot of small business owners, I completely panicked with stage number one. But stage number two was to pivot quickly and pivot towards immune health. So back in March, I don't know about any of you guys, but I didn't know how long COVID was going to be around. However, I made the decision to pivot towards immune health for a number of reasons. First of all, COVID, that it may still be around. But second of all, that respiratory tract infections like cold influenza are major burdens every year all around the world. And third of all, that I've got a personal story, because I myself live with two immune conditions, multiple sclerosis and allergic asthma. So I wanted to produce something for the immune system, but something that was novel and innovative. So I decided we would get our vitamin C from food sources, so from berries and cherries. We've got Indian gooseberry, strawberry, elderberry, and also acerola cherry. We get our vitamin B12 from Irish mushroom. We get our vitamin D3 from marine algae. We get our magnesium from the Irish Sea. We get our selenium and zinc from highly absorbable sources, similar to nuts. And finally, we get flavonoids from organic Japanese matcha green tea. So you can see very quickly in March, we pivoted. And even though we didn't know at the time what ingredients were trending, we actually picked correctly. So we got acerola, elderberry, vitamin D, mushrooms, green tea, zinc and selenium in our product. So the next step then was to produce. So we went ahead and produced, and this is our product which we've been able to come up with in the last 5 months. from concept to a physical product, which is now available for sale. It's called Immune Fix, and it's a delicious high-strength powdered format. We have 3 European Food Safety Authority health claims, one for the immune system, one for oxidative stress, and one for reducing fatigue. The product is fully plant-based, so it's suitable for vegans and vegetarians. It's also gluten-free, so suitable for those with celiac disease. And it's clean label. We don't have any artificial ingredients or colors, anything like that. And finally, it's in a glass jar with an aluminium lid, so it's 100% recyclable. So we've tried to tick a lot of boxes. So 1 serving contains the same amount of vitamin B12 as 250 grams of steak, the same amount of vitamin C as 13 tangerines, the same amount of vitamin D3 as 5 glasses of super milk, the same amount of magnesium as 30 prunes, the same amount of selenium as over 2,500 sunflower seeds, the same amount of zinc as 75 Brazil nuts, the same amount of antioxidants as 5 large carrots, and the same amount of EGC flavonoid as 15,000 bananas. And that's all in 1 serving, which is 5 grams of powder. So we were lucky enough to sell out our first small batch, and we're now our second batch is ready commercially. So that's a quick introduction to Phytofix, and I'm just going to leave my contact details up again. I don't know, I'm probably running out of time.
Yeah, unfortunately we're over time now. Right,
yeah.
Great. Thank you very much, Conor. That's super interesting. We see that COVID is really having an impact on those sales for those particular vitamin D, elderberry. If I can get hands on that stuff, I think.
Yeah, you can see the segment was growing at a rate of about 3 or 4% a year, and now in 1 year it's growing 52%, which is just astronomical. And a lot of big brands have really, they've sold out and had to.
So if anyone has any spare, supply of elderberry, let us know. Then we can share that around. So yeah, cool, great. Thanks very much. So yes, that's the end of the first part. We will go on a break now for around, I don't know, what should we do? Should we give him a bit of time? 5 minutes, Ryan?
You got 5 minutes. We're generous.
We'll be back here at 43 then. Ready for our next batch of startups who will be presenting. Okay, thanks a lot.